Hello everyone. Well, here's a face that pretty much everyone in Australia knows by now, but for the benefit of my overseas viewers where this story might not be getting any coverage, this is Erin Patterson, the woman who made a beef Wellington with mushrooms and served it to 4 people, 3 of whom ended up dead, and one who was in critical condition for 2 weeks but from the latest I've heard is starting to make a recovery. Regular viewers to my channel will know that I'm a strong advocate of innocent until proven guilty and strongly against people being tried in the court of public opinion. This story is an interesting one though, as the circumstantial evidence in this matter is pretty strong in my view. So I'll begin with the disclaimer. I'm not saying she's a murderer, but I am saying that in my view, on what I know of the matter, I strongly believe that the deaths weren't accidental, and it's my personal opinion that she's a murderer. So again, for the benefit of my overseas viewers, here's what happened.
Good evening. 3 people have now died and another is fighting for life after being poisoned by wild mushrooms at a lunch with friends in Gippsland. Homicide detectives are investigating the deaths and have questioned a 48-year-old woman who has now been released. Amber Johnston with this report.
Reverend Ian Wilkinson, a local pastor at the Currumbara Baptist Church, fighting for life as police launch a homicide probe.
It's a really shocking situation. All the people who are involved are very well known in our community, which is a tight-knit community, and very well respected and loved.
Reverend Wilkinson's wife Heather, her sister and her husband died after eating toxic wild mushrooms at a lunch with friends.
It's a piece the size of a 20-cent coin is sufficient to kill a person.
Police say the 2 couples were dining with friends at a home in Leongatha last Saturday. The group became sick the following day and went to hospital thinking it was gastro, but their conditions deteriorated. 66-year-old Heather and her 70-year-old sister Gail died this week. Her husband Don, aged 70, last night. Reverend Wilkinson and another friend remain in hospital while other guests from the lunch have since been discharged.
Okay, so I need to jump in and do a bit of clarification and correction here, as there was some amount of misreporting in the first week following the incident. There was no 2 other people at the gathering who went to hospital and were later released. The 2 people were supposedly her children, but she stated later that they weren't at the meal. They'd gone to the movies, and I'll come back to that later.
The homicide squad raided a home in Leongatha yesterday with detectives questioning a 48-year-old local woman. She has since been released as the investigation continues.
Police aren't ruling out foul play.
No, not at this stage. It's important that they explore all possibilities to determine if this was just an awful accident or something more sinister. Now, we do have confirmation on the identities of those other 2 victims. Their names are Don and Gail Patterson. Of course, Gail is the sister of Heather, who is the other victim in this awful ordeal. Tonight, Ian remains in hospital in a critical condition. A service was held here this morning for churchgoers to extend their thoughts and prayers. They also took the opportunity to highlight what a huge impact the couple have had on the local community. Reverend Ian obviously playing a huge role in the church here, and his wife Heather, a teacher at the secondary school, as well as a passionate volunteer. So a community in mourning tonight.
Okay, so let's start with the relationship of those at the dinner to Erin Patterson. Gail and Don Patterson were Erin's mother and father-in-law, the parents of her estranged husband Simon Patterson. Heather Wilkinson was Gail's sister, and she was married to the local Methodist minister Ian Wilkinson. He's the one who was critical but is now apparently showing signs of improvement. Okay, now let's start looking at the suspect stuff. Over a year ago, in May 2022, Erin's estranged husband Simon spent 21 days in hospital, 2 of those 3 weeks in intensive care with a mystery stomach illness. At one stage he was so ill the family had been called into the hospital to pay their last respects, as the doctors feared he wasn't going to make it through. However, he did survive. In addition to her husband's previous mystery illness, there was the issue of the food dehydrator. The story goes that according to her, she used 2 different types of mushrooms in preparing the dish: button mushrooms bought fresh from her local supermarket, and mushrooms she had supposedly purchased from an Asian grocer somewhere in Melbourne, but claims to not be able to recall exactly where, months prior, that she then dried in a food hydrator. That act sounds pretty suspect in itself. If you just bought fresh mushrooms, why would you add old mushrooms from months ago? Then there was this reported in the Daily Mail. Miss Patterson also addressed media reports that police investigating the deaths had seized a food dehydrator at a local tip, saying it was hers. In the statement, Miss Patterson admitted she lied to investigators when she told them she dumped it at the tip a long time ago. Miss Patterson said she was at the hospital with her children discussing the food dehydrator when her ex-husband, the son of the dead couple, asked, "Is that what you used to poison them?" Worried that she might lose custody of the couple's children, Miss Patterson said she then panicked and dumped the dehydrator at the tip. Well, she was having a busy day, wasn't she? This was at the hospital the day after the poisoning, so let's go through the timeline. 1. She was the only person who supposedly ate the meal that wasn't in hospital fighting for their life the following day. 2. The moment she thought her ex-husband was onto her, she went home, got the very item that her husband had accused her of using to poison his parents, and took it to the tip. She later lied to the police about it, and her preposterous excuse was that she was worried about losing custody of her kids. That doesn't even make any sense. 3. She later claimed that she presented at hospital the following day with stomach cramps and diarrhoea, but was sent to Monash Hospital, where she claims to have spent the night on a saline drip and given liver-protecting medication. So let's get this straight. She wasn't at the hospital with her own illness. She was there to show her concern for those that ate her food, even though everyone else that ate the food, but her, was in hospital fighting for their lives. She was still well enough to go back home and make a trip to the dump with the food dehydrator, and then she suddenly developed stomach cramps and diarrhoea. Right. Then there was this attempt at an Emmy nomination.
Erin Patterson says she wants to clear the record.
I'm devastated. I love them.
Revealing she had used mushrooms that she bought from the local supermarket, as well as other dried mushrooms from an Asian grocery store. Cooking a beef Wellington at her home in Leongatha on July 29th for 4 guests. Her former in-laws Don and Gail Patterson and Gail's sister Heather Wilkinson, who all died a week later. Gail's husband, Pastor Ian Wilkinson, remains critically ill. In a written statement sent to Victoria Police via her lawyers last Friday and obtained exclusively by the ABC, Ms Patterson says she too was hospitalised, going to the Monash Medical Centre 2 days after the lunch. I had gone there because I had bad stomach pains and terrible diarrhoea, she said. I was put on a saline drip and stayed in hospital overnight. I was also given some medicine I was told was a liver protective drug. Ms Patterson says her children were not at the lunch as police previously said, and had instead gone to a movie, eating leftovers later which had the mushrooms scraped off. Police have revealed little about the investigation, saying Ms Patterson was a suspect and the deaths were unexplained, but not necessarily suspicious. Detectives returned to a Coonawarra tip last week to speak to staff after taking a dehydrator days earlier. Ms Patterson says the dehydrator was hers and she did take it to the tip in a moment of panic. Police say the victims showed symptoms consistent with poisoning from death cap mushrooms, but they're awaiting toxicology reports. Ms Patterson maintains her innocence and says she is stressed and overwhelmed by the deaths of loved ones.
So did you hear how distraught she is?
I'm devastated. I love them.
Straight out of the Amber Heard Christine Blasey Ford cry book. The quivering chin, the crying voice, but absolutely no tears. No tears in the eyes, no shininess under the eyes from having wiped away tears. In fact, her face looks drier than a week-old beef Wellington. Nothing but an act. Then there's her claim that she bought the mushrooms from an Asian grocer months earlier. She claims that the packet of mushrooms had handwritten packaging, but of course can't remember where it was exactly that she bought them. She's trying to make it sound like she bought the mushrooms from some backyard operation without proper regulation, and that's how she ended up with poisonous mushrooms. Well, let's assume she did buy them from an Asian grocer. There's been no other reports of people getting mushroom poisoning from an Asian grocer in the Mount Waverley area where she claims to have bought them. So I guess we're meant to believe that she just happened to be the only person who was sold poisonous mushrooms from a grocer who sells mushrooms to undoubtedly hundreds of people. The inference that the package of mushrooms was handwritten is meaningless in a world where you buy mushrooms from the supermarket, unpackaged, and put as many into a bag yourself as you want. The handwritten package claim is just a ruse on her part to try and make it sound like she innocently bought mushrooms from someone dodgy. Then there's this revelation. Family friend claims deadly mushroom cook had collection of books about fungi in her home. Erin Patterson had a collection of books about mushrooms which she kept at her home where her fatal beef Wellington lunch took place, Daily Mail Australia has been told. A friend claimed the shelves of her family home at Leongatha included books about delicious yet potentially deadly fungi. Daily Mail Australia on Wednesday reported Miss Patterson, 48, was an experienced forager who, like many families in the area, picked mushrooms when they were in season. The friend said she had a number of books on the subject in her library. Now let's hear from the mushroom expert on the likelihood of buying death cap mushrooms from a grocer.
I'm so devastated about what's happened.
Unfortunately, she can't remember which store, leaving local growers stumped.
I cannot imagine how it would get into a store.
Joseph Sestokis is an exotic mushroom grower in Gippsland in Victoria's east. He reckons it's impossible to produce poisonous mushrooms for sale.
A poisonous mushroom needs a tree to grow with. A commercial grower can't grow death caps in the way that we grow mushrooms. We grow entirely different mushrooms that don't have a symbiosis with a tree. And that death caps have a symbiosis with a tree. That's why they grow in the wild.
Another question I haven't heard asked is that if you claim to have bought dried mushrooms months earlier, then why would you need a food dehydrator to dry out already dried mushrooms? If you dump the food dehydrator out of panic, then doesn't that imply that you dried the mushrooms in said food dehydrator yourself and didn't use the dried mushrooms from months ago that you claim to have used? If you knew that you didn't use the dehydrator to dry the mushrooms yourself, then you'd also know that it wouldn't contain any evidence of you having used it for that purpose, and you wouldn't have any reason to dispose of it. Okay, so at this point, I think I've dealt with all the inconsistencies in her version of events. What we do know for sure is that she has lied about certain things, so we can know with certainty from this that she's prepared to lie and has lied. Now let's move on to premeditation and possible motive. Another question I haven't heard answered yet is in regard to her clarification that her kids weren't at the meal and had gone to the movies. What I would want to know is, did the kids go to the movies by their own choice, or did their mother pack them off to the movies to ensure they wouldn't be there when the lunch of death was served up? That's important because it can suggest that she made meticulous plans to ensure that people she didn't want harmed wouldn't be harmed. I also think that the food dehydrator could present an argument for premeditation, in that the whole purpose of a food dehydrator is to preserve food for later use. Just before I move on to motive, there was her claim that she was hospitalised and stayed overnight at Monash Hospital. I was discussing the case at work with a colleague, and she told me anecdotally that she saw a story on the news that Monash Hospital denied that she'd been admitted there. A couple of days later, I asked where she had heard this, as after speaking with her, I did some searching and couldn't find any reporting about that. I questioned her about the veracity of what she had told me, and she was adamant that she saw a story about that on Channel 9. Again, I haven't been able to find any reporting about that, which seems odd. So if one of you guys watching this video can comment to verify that, then I'd really appreciate it. If it's true that Monash Hospital deny her being admitted, that would pretty much blow her claim of also becoming ill completely out of the water. Again, just before the topic of motive, there was the drawings and writings on the kitchen wall of her previous residence. The media seems to have tried to make something of this, and I even heard the word satanic being used. As best as I can tell, it's just bullshit media fakery. The media has tried to make something of the fact that the kids had written R.I.P. Grandma, attempting to make some spurious link between what the kids had written a few years prior and the fact that the Pattersons that were poisoned were the kids' grandparents. But I would suggest that RIP Grandma and the gravestones drawn were in relation to Erin Patterson's own mother, who died a few years ago from cancer. I'm only bringing it up because I wanted to play the media's interview of the painter employed to paint over it when the house was going to be put on the market.
Another twist in the poison mushroom case. Disturbing drawings on the wall of a home formerly owned by the woman who served the deadly meal have emerged.
I mean, look at the headline, Hidden Secret. Fuck off, Channel 9. If I were being investigated for an alleged murder and I didn't tell you about the steaming dump I took back in 1988, would that mean I was keeping a hidden secret? If anything adds credence to Erin Patterson's claim that she's being harassed by the media, it's dickhead stories like this one. The kids' drawings on the wall of the kitchen in the house that they used to live in a few years ago has nothing to do with the mushroom poisoning thing.
As Gillian Lantouris reports, a local tradie employed to paint the house made the discovery.
I am dead. No, I am really dead. That's just one example of the macabre scribble on the kitchen wall of Erin Patterson's former Corumburra home.
I was a little bit scared, mortified. Like, what parent would let a kid draw on this wall?
So you were a bit scared of drawings of gravestones, were you? You fucking wimp.
Now, tombstones down the bottom sort of done it for me.
Yeah, mate, sort of done it for me isn't a phrase used by people who know how to speak English.
Yeah, like rest in peace grandma and rest in peace me and all that.
The painter says detectives have asked him for the images.
Anyway, back to the serious stuff. Motive. Here's where the investigation against Erin Patterson runs into some trouble. The story goes that her ex-husband was invited to the meal but pulled out at the last minute. She says that he cancelled in the days prior and hence had plenty of notice that he wasn't coming prior to preparing the meal. If her intention was to bump off her ex-husband for whatever reason, she argues that it doesn't make sense that she would prepare a poisoned meal for someone who wasn't going to be there to eat it. I read an article from a former detective who was arguing that it would be hard to get a conviction against her as all the evidence was circumstantial. The prosecution will need motive to get across the line, according to said cop. Even in the last few days, though, we've seen a conviction based on circumstantial evidence, that of Lucy Letby, the UK nurse convicted of killing half a dozen babies. I don't know the particulars of that court case, but her conviction seems based on the circumstantial evidence that she was the only nurse on duty when all the babies died. Then there was Peter Falconia from years ago. His body has never been found, but it didn't stop Murdoch being convicted of his murder. Again, the evidence was circumstantial. So what may have been the motive for Erin Patterson? The story goes that she invited the Pattersons and Wilkinsons over for a meal to discuss the possibility of trying to reconcile with her estranged husband Simon. Her version of the relationship, though, is that she's the one that wasn't interested in reconciliation. I guess it requires further investigation to establish which scenario is actually true. But does some twisted sense of revenge need to be the motive? This is Jane Tappan, a serial killer of the late 19th century, early 20th century. She was a poisoner. She killed for money and property, but she also killed for psychopathic reasons. She was able to make herself the centre of attention and portray herself as a caregiver, where she would feign caregiving of those she was actually poisoning to feed her own ego, getting off on being seen by others as a wonderful person. This is what Erin Patterson did when her husband was gravely ill. She rallied around him, constantly keeping the family updated on his condition, playing the role of the champion of care. I'm not saying that that's undeniably what she was doing, I'm just saying that it does happen. In closing, I think that when the only person who doesn't end up dead or in intensive care is the one who cooked the meal, it's pretty glaringly obvious what's going on there.